just giving everyone fair warning. So this talk is called Ruby on Rails from Zero to Deployed in 60 minutes. If you're at that conference, make sure you thank all the sponsors for chipping in for their portion of things. To get started, just a little bit about myself. My name is Chris Johnson. I'm manager of application development with a company called Getty Images out of Madison, Wisconsin. Written a couple books with the Pragmatic Bookshelf. I also teach part-time at Madison College. This talk is the entire semester class on Rails that I teach crammed into 60 minutes. So it's the Cliff Notes version. You may have to watch it again later to get every little piece out of it, but I'm going to give you all the information to build something and get it deployed. Once in a while I do a little bit of consulting, and then most places you can find me is Johnson CH on the internet. So just that conference, family focused, my family, wife and 2 daughters. They're both here, or all 3 are here, and so they're little geeks in training. A little bit about Getty. We are among the world's leading creators and distributors of award-winning imagery, video, music, all that kind of stuff. You've probably seen us in magazines, the bottom of pictures for photo credits. May have bought stuff from iStock or ThinkStock in the past. So if you want to talk about images or anything, I like photography too, besides doing software development. And I work on one of the tools that brings in content from our contributors around the world. And so working through that, I get to work with about 12 terabytes of data coming in on a weekly basis. So if you're interested in moving files around and stuff, come talk to me or another one of my coworkers is going to sit in the back, and you can heckle him later too. Shameless plug, just because it's cool to have written a book. Web Development Recipes, both the first and second edition with the Pragmatic Bookshelf. A lot of little nuggets of information. Not chicken nuggets, just nuggets of knowledge. So it's my shameless plug for that. So today, what we're going to do, right? I'm going to go through a few definitions. I'm going to hit them fast and hard. Fast and furious would be a good pun to use in this too. But so we're going to go through a few things. We're going to talk about setting up a development environment and how we can lower the barrier to entry there. We're going to build a little application called Crux. We're going to deploy it, and then who knows, and then we're going to profit from this awesome adventure here. We're going to overtake gists from GitHub. But a little disclaimer that this talk is not how to build enterprise level applications. I work on a code base that's over 3.5 years old. It's way different than what we're doing here, but this is to get you building something and get it deployed and get that instant satisfaction so you can start from somewhere and know all the pieces that are there. Better slide talking about that. It's a little simple app. The things we're going to talk about and define today. What is a cloud IDE? Heroku, Ruby, Ruby Gems, Rails, Git, and Bundler. So cloud IDE, right? It is a integrated development environment that works in your web browser. This really helps out folks getting started with things. There's a few of them out there. We're going to use Cloud 9 today. There's another one called Nitrous that's really good. They let you just work in an environment and you don't mess up your local machines. You can try things out. They're really good for people that are up and coming and getting started. You can do all of these activities we're going to do today on a Chromebook, right, or at the public library. So this opens the barrier to programming, lowers that for anybody, makes it really accessible. Heroku is a platform as a service. They're owned by Salesforce. They allow you to do free web hosting, basically, of your Rails application. It runs for as long as it's being used at a very low level, so 1 to 2 users hitting your app. As soon as they're not using it for 30 minutes, they put it to sleep to help save their system resources, but it's free, so you get what you get. Ruby, this is the language that we're going to talk about today. It's a dynamic, open source language. It's really easy to read and grasp. To me, it makes a lot of sense. Some folks it doesn't, but I think to most people it does. The package manager that we'll be using to install things is called Ruby Gems, and this is just the libraries for working with Ruby applications. To tie it together, we're going to use a gem called Rails, which is more a collection of gems actually. And Rails is the framework for building web applications in Ruby. And it's been around for a little over 10 years now. Made famous by 37 Signals, who's now basecamp.com. And that's what we're looking at. Git, I'm hoping that all of you are developers and have heard of it. If you haven't, on Wednesday afternoon, both Corey Drew and Keith Dalby are giving talks on Git. They're both great speakers, entertaining and full of information. If you haven't seen either of them speak, I highly recommend going to one or both of their talks. Another thing that we'll use is Bundler, and this is the dependency manager tool for the Ruby community. It works most of the time. Like any really good tool, if you use it wrong, you can shoot yourself in the foot with it. We'll talk a little bit about that later. So when you're setting up a development environment, you do have options. You could set up your local machine, or you could create a VM. Both of these require installing all the libraries, all the dependencies, making sure you get all the right versions and everything. You could use the latest insert hot new provisioning library here, whether it's Ansible or some scripts with Docker or whatever. But again, you still have to install everything and work through getting all the right dependencies. This is where a cloud editor comes into play, right? You're learning a new language and a new framework. If you haven't used Rails or Ruby before, this will just isolate it all in one place and get everything orchestrated for you and not worry about infecting your local machine or any other projects you're using on a daily basis to make some money. So you have these options, and you can ask which one is for you. We're going to use the cloud one today, but everybody is their own person and can pick the ones they want themselves. So without further ado, let's get into the meat of this. We're going to build this tool called Crux. And here's a wireframe of what this application is going to look like. It is a pasty clone. I know, really high and adventurous out here. It lets you create a title for your paste and then put some code in there. Really simple, plop stuff in there. So we're going to have one database table to store information in. We're going to have an ID for it, title code, a slug, and then timestamps in there. We'll talk about how that kind of lays out. But that's where we're going to build here. So let's go ahead and get started. So I've gone ahead and logged into Cloud9. It's a free service. You can have unlimited public workspaces. Public workspaces mean your code can get accessed. So for little test samples like this, it's a great service to use. We're going to start off by creating a new workspace. And we'll give it a really awesome name like create the demo. We're going to pick a Ruby environment. As you can see, they have all kinds of different versions of things. Let's all pick a better name. And we'll let it create its workspace. Well, this is going, are there any questions? Feel free to ask throughout too. Otherwise, I'm going to keep moving along here. So I'll point out too while that's going on. On GitHub is Johnson CH, where you can find me. I do have this presentation as a Git repository, both the presentation and then my presenter notes. Presenter notes are the snippets of code for the building the application. So you can follow along with those later and save yourself some typing. All right, so we got our environment booted up, and Cloud9 tries to be really nice to us and create a Rails application for us. But we're going to just kind of nuke that out after we do a little housekeeping. First, we're going to set up our Git information just so that when we want to deploy this out to Heroku, everything is tagged properly. So I'm going to put my name in here and my email. And then from inside this workspace directory, if we look at all the files here on the left side, it is the Rails application. We're going to start by nuking them with an rm-rf star and just clean up all those files just so we can have a good starting spot. Now, we're going to go ahead and use Rails 5 today. It just came out a few weeks ago, and so we're going to touch on things that are new to it, but not a whole lot. We're going to stick to the basics, which will work in both 4 and 5. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to install the Rails gem just so it's there. So do a gem, install Rails. So gem is, you can use Ruby gems to go out and download the library, and I think I can make this a little bigger. No. Can't make the terminal bigger. Can those folks in the back see the terminal okay? Okay. So that's going to install the Rails gem, which, like I mentioned earlier, is a collection of gems. And by that one command, it installed 17 libraries. So they've broken out everything into little pieces. We can verify that we have the right version by doing a Rails-V. And we get Rails 5 out here. So now we can generate our new application. And so we'll do a Rails new crux. And that's going to generate the folder structure and some basic files for us. And it's going to go ahead and install all the gems that are needed for this application to work. And while that's installing, we'll open up the File Explorer here and take a look around. So we have several folders here. It's a little bit confusing because there's a lot of folders. Once you start to break down and look at them a little bit closer, it does make sense where code goes. We'll start off at the top here. The app folder is what contains the majority of your application code. So you have things for assets, controllers, models, and views is where we're going to be working in today. There's also folders for channels, helpers, jobs, and mailers. So channels are for your WebSockets, jobs are for background jobs, and mailers are for sending email. Topics for a later date. In the config folder, we have our configuration. We keep track of our database connection through what's called a YAML file. And this lists out our database connections that our application is going to use. It's going to use SQLite by default. For each individual environment, we can have specific information about that. We're going to be just working in development and production today and not making many changes between the two. We also have a test folder which contains the tests for your application. So by default, when you use Rails to generate code for you, it will put files in the test folder. So it encourages you actually to write tests with your application. Now that the app is finished running, we can start it up and just see that we have a working project. Nothing really exciting, but let's take a look at it. So bundle exec, Rails S -B, and some specific stuff for Cloud9 where we're going to bind to an IP address and a port. Need to be in the directory. here we'll see our application is running. So we could shift this, right? Yep, done. This just shows that we're running Rails, what version it is, what your Ruby version is. Just confirmation that everything is loaded and installed correctly so we can get started building something. So the first thing we're going to do here is generate some code to put some static pages on our site so we can give some information to our users and get a little style so it looks nice while we're working through it here. And we're going to take in the terminal here, we're going to use a generator to generate those files for us. Bundle exec, Rails generate, controller, static pages, index, about. So what we did here is we are saying, hey Rails, go ahead and run your generate command, create me a new controller, call the controller static pages, and add 2 actions to that, 2 methods to it. And those are going to be the routes that we can hit in our browser to see these pages. And we can see as we ran it, it generated a bunch of code for us, some files. It added a couple routes, which are how we access those pages. It created the template files for those. It created our tests for the controller. And created a helper file, and then a CoffeeScript file, and a Sass file. So everything we could need to go forward, it created all those base files for us. And if we open them up and look, they're, for the most part, pretty empty. So if we explore our controller here and look at our static pages controller, it's a small code file. It's got the 2 methods in there that we need for those 2 actions. We look at our views for those. So for each controller action, there is a corresponding view file. So we look at index. It's very basic with just some empty code in there. And we can test these out by loading our application again. Then you see I prefix everything with this bundle exec. And that is to use bundler, the dependency manager, and say only load the dependencies that I care about. Execute them within that. And it does that by looking at a file called the gem file. This lists out all your dependencies and the version you want of them, whether it's an equivalent of 1 or a certain number and higher, only a certain number in minor versions. Their documentation page lists out all these different settings. But this allows you then to share your code with another developer and know they're going to pull down the right dependencies. So a typical dependency manager. So bundle exec is not always needed, but it is the safe way to make sure you're only loading the things you're expecting to load, so you're not loading any other libraries. If we go look at our application now, we can go to our controller, and we can look at the index action. And we can see that it's got that code in there and the about page. Now, looking at that URL structure, that would be kind of silly to display to our users if they're coming to our site, right? If we're going to have them come to an index page, we probably want them just to come to the root of the application. We take the about page, we want them to go to just /about. So let's go modify our routes file in order to point at the right spot. So inside of config, we have our routes file, which directs where requests coming into the application, which controller and action they get routed to. So we're going to change the about, where's my mouse? We're going to change the about to be get/about. So anytime the application comes to /about, we're going to take it to the static pages index. Helps if you put quotes in. And then for the index, we're going to set it to be the root of our application. We want, anytime they come to just our website domain, we're going to take them to that index page. So we're going to say root is static pages index. It's one of those typing days. And save that file. So now, when we refresh this page and we try to get to it, it's going to blow up because we took out the routes that were there. But if we get rid of the static pages, we can go right to that. And now when we come to the base of our application, it's going to bring them to the index page. Now we got these pages and kind of route set up, but it looks really ugly, right? I mean, we want to make it look stylish. So we're going to go ahead and use a free theme from bootswatch.org or .com, bootswatch.com. The one I like is Simplex. So we're going to use this theme to give our application a nice looking set of styles, because I am no UI designer here. So we're going to take the CSS for this, so we can just go ahead and make our application look good. And we're going to copy and paste that wholesale, because who wants to write all that CSS? And we're going to create a file for it in our assets directory inside of style sheets. So what Rails does is it allows you to organize your code by new file. There we go. And segregate everything out. And then what will happen during runtime is it'll compress all of your JavaScript and CSS into whatever number of files you want, but by default it'll bring it into one file for you so that you end up having that available. So we're going to just take advantage of that, separate it out, and let our main application CSS file say, just put everything together for us. Oops, wrong, to the wrong file. Grab everything from this directory and put it together. Yeah? It's the part of the it's one of the gems in the Rails framework that does that for you. So it's called the asset pipeline, and it's this notion of taking all of your assets and compressing them together. And then it also takes care of the putting this log on the end so that your JavaScript is versioned for caching purposes too when you deploy it to production. So it's a built-in feature. It's nice for the most part until you start writing too much complicated JavaScript that you don't want interacting with each other, and that you're writing JavaScript, so you have your problem there. It doesn't do the caching part, but it creates it so that a browser can cache it, because it tags the file with a version number at the end. So, yep. All right, so now that we have our styling in there, we can refresh our page and I didn't want to refresh that one. See, just a little subtle change in the font for the static pages index. But we want to get a nice layout in there so we actually can see what's going on with our application. So we're gonna, I'm going to grab some code, and we're going to modify our application template. So inside of our views folder, so we're in, close these up here, make it a little bit cleaner. Inside of app views, we have our layouts. We have an application layout. And what this is a template file that takes any code inside of the specific page files and renders it out inside the body. So we can give a consistent look across our entire site. You know, think PHP header and footer on a site, or master pages and ASP classic or .NET or .NET non-MVC. It's been so long since I've done that. So I'm going to replace the body here with some HTML. So this is just basic Bootstrap container structure here to give a nav bar. Nothing too exciting. And then we've kept our Ruby here that's used in line. So the extension we have on this file is a .erb, and that's the templating library that we're using. And that's the default templating library with Rails. So this code then is evaluated when the page is rendered, when Ruby renders the page to send it back up, and outputs information there. So this is going to pass in the other page to it. If we save that, we can go ahead and now see our site starting to look a little bit more like our web application here. So go talk to those venture capitalists and get them to whip out their checkbook at this point, right? I mean, we've got the page right here. But we can add next thing, add a little style to this home page, give a little bit more HTML in there to kind of give it a little bit better polished look. So let's open up the index.html ERB file inside of the static pages, and we'll replace it with this. So it's just another set of Bootstrap code, and it's going to give us a little Jumbotron widget on that page. So we got a bunch of static pages. You're here to see how to do things dynamically. So we're going to add a little bit of functionality to this, and we're going to add our first real feature of our paste tool. So to do that, we're going to use a generator again to generate code for us. But this time we're going to use the scaffolding generator. Now this one is really good when you're learning how to write or build Rails applications. The more seasoned you get, the less you tend to use a generator. And I think that's true with any framework or language. The more seasoned you get in that tool, you tend to write more by hand because you know what you're doing. You don't want the extra cruft that they give you. But for this, we're going to build something quick and get it out the door. So we're going to scaffold the paste model, which is going to have a title, that's a string, and code, that's text, and a slug, that's a string. This is going to generate a bunch of things for us. It's going to generate our controller. It's going to generate our model file. That's where we can put our business logic in there. It's going to generate the view files for us. It's going to put the form in there for the HTML form in there to actually make the posts with all the data, an edit form that can be populated with pre-existing data, and then a display page. So it's going to go through the whole CRUD operations and show those. It's also going to generate, again, the style sheets and JavaScript files for us too, and tests. And then the last thing it does is it generates what's called a database migration. And inside of our DB folder here, we have a migrate folder. What's great about these is it allows us to version our database schema and pass it along to other developers so that they can get their database set up in the right order. And it will check your database to see if you have any pending migrations and then run through them in the order. The pro tip here that some of my students get hung up on is they run through a migration and they let it make a change to their database and they realize they didn't like that change and they just go and edit the migration file again. It stores the last run migration as a timestamp over here. It stores that in the database as the schema version. So it doesn't allow you to run that migration over again and blow away anything that's existing. You have to write another file. Just a little pro tip if you're watching this later. So we just need to get those changes now written to our database. And so we're going to use another tool built in the Rails framework called migrate. So we're going to do a bundle exec. db :migrate. What that's going to do is it's going to run through our migration files. In this case, we just have the one, and write them to the database. So you can see here it outputs what it's doing, and it created that table for us in our database. So our table exists and is ready for us to use. And with that, we can start up our application again, and we can use it. It's fully working at this point. The next thing we'll do after this is work on our user flow, modify things a little bit. A lot of tutorials you'd run into on Rails out there, you're going to start off with this, and this be the end of it. But we're going to iterate through it and work through a little scenario of what our users may want to see. So if we pull this up and we go to /paste, the paste controller that we just created, we see here we have page, and it lists out the title, code, and slug, the values we put in. This is where scaffolding is nice, but it puts in all the stuff that we put in and may not necessarily need to be displayed. But we could create a new paste, and we could call it, foo and def new let's bar, and we can add a slug to it. Can't leave a typo in your sample. And create our paste. It shows us all the values out of that one. We could edit it and update it. Then we can go and look at our list of all these pastes. Okay, so functionality, function-wise, we got a little proof of concept, we know things work. But looking back at our wireframe, if we jump back to that, we just have a title and code there, right? So we're going to generate the slug for the user, we can infer from this, and we're only going to let them put a title for their snippet in and their code. We're going to simplify that input. And then when you think about it too, go to a site like Pasty or just GitHub, you just come right to that new create form unless you're looking at an existing piece of code. So let's mimic that behavior where when they come to our index, we wanted to show them a piece of code. So we're going to do a little modification to our controller. So let's close out some files here. And our paste controller. And we're going to modify this index action. And over here, we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on. So we have two types of variables in Ruby. There's instance variables, which you see here, and then there's class variables, or local variables, sorry. So there's instance variables and local variables. Here's an example of an instance variable with that @ sign in front of it. Example of a local variable is going to be down. There's a one in this controller. Would be similar to this. Paste. The instance variable here works like a little bit of magic. And by declaring it as an instance variable, it's available to everything that's part of this render process. So when this index method gets hit, the variable gets set, and then the view template gets rendered. So any variables we create here are available to our view template. So they're available to the view so we can iterate over them or use them or pass information to make that view dynamic. Well, here what's going on is we're setting a paste variable to a collection of pastes that we're pulling back from the database. But instead, we're going to now change it to be a new instance so we can display a form on this page rather than the previous iterating over everything. So I'll do a @paste. This is a new instance. Paste. And then instead of rendering the index, we're just going to render the new action. So I'm going to say, hey, I know you came to this place, you came to this index action, but really we just want to show the new, so we can show a form for people to fill out with the paste in there. So now, when we go to paste right here, we're going to see that new paste form. So it changed how that is displaying. But we need to clean this up and make it look a little bit nicer, because when I started filling this out, you could see that that line was kind of in there. But let's get that box bigger and just get that looking a little bit nicer. And I'm going to cheat again with a bunch of HTML code, because I really don't want to type a lot of this out right now. But we'll walk through it here. So I'm going to go open up what's called the form partial. So in Rails, you have the ability to create templates, and then you have the ability to create partial templates, or pieces that are reused over and over again. The common nomenclature is to end up having a full underscore form, and underscore means it's a partial file, but to be used then for both your new and your edit forms. So the same bit of form logic is used in both those places, but rather than duplicating it, we're just going to include that code snippet. So if we modify that form file, we can see what the ERB looks like in all the Rails wonderfulness. And looking at this, what happens is the form takes in an extra bit of information. So when we look at the new file here, we can see that instance variable at paste, which we set in our controller, is getting passed now into the form, or into the partial as paste. When we go back to our partial, we can see that it's here, that paste variable is now available to this. We've kind of passed it along through. And we're using that to set up our form. And we're using Rails built-in form helpers, which generates the HTML for you based on this loosely HTML-looking code. But let's nuke this so that it's all nice and full of divs from Bootstrap, but that gives us a nice little look. So all we've really done is replace the HTML pieces to style the form to look a little bit better with Bootstrap. So now when we reload here, we get our form that fills up the whole page. Nice big block to put code in there. This is just basic HTML here. But when we fill out the form, and we go to who something, some create that. When you look in this display page, our code isn't necessarily formatted, and it's kind of in that weird look where it might be better to make it look a little bit more like our form, right? And just have that title show up on the page, and then the code formatted nicely inside of a pre-block so that it doesn't lose any of its formatting structure, and that it doesn't interfere if you're pasting HTML or JavaScript in here, run on the page. So we're going to mess with this page a little bit, and that's the show page. And again, I've gone with the Martha Stewart approach here and pre-baked some code in here. And we're going to change this so that we have our little notice block that says the paste was created. But now in an H2, we're going to display the title of the paste. And then down inside of a pre-block, we're going to display the code. So if we save that, go over here, and let's create a new one. fill out the slug. Now we get our page formatting a little bit nicer. However, I think we put, and I say we, even though I'm doing all the typing up here, I need to move the code over a step there so that the pre-tag handles that. So the next thing that in our feature progression, right, is that slug field on the bottom. It's not putting any validations in there. It's letting me type whatever I want. It's not being used at all. We're not referencing it. So what we're going to do is make add that value to the page, and we're going to say, hey, every time a paste is created, let's create a random character slug that's unique to that specific paste, so that the user can send out that URL to a coworker. And we're going to do that by putting some business logic in our model. And the model is what talks to the database and allows us to put in our business logic and put things in place so that we can work through any requirements we have of modifying our data. So I'm going to open up the paste model here. See, it's a pretty empty file, and it inherits from application record, so it's using inheritance, and that's where it's getting the Ruby magic from. It's just pulling it from the class above. And a lot of times you do hear Rails is black magic, you don't know what's going on. Really, it's just pulling from the class above. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a callback that says before create, call the method generate, let's call it generate slug. And so we're going to create a private method called generate slug. And that method is going to return, or it's going to assign to the slug property of our paste. So it's going to set the value for the slug to just a random URL 64 encoded string here. So self, which is the current instance of our paste, so this Ruby's object-oriented, current instance is going to be self. And we're going to say the property slug is going to be equal to secure URL safe, so that base 64. So we create a safe URL, base 64 encoded random set of digits, right? So the easiest way to identify this. Save that file. So now, when we go ahead and create a slug, and I'm going to pull up a new terminal here to show you another piece about the Rails framework that is really nice, and that's the interactive console that you have available to you. So there's a console, which is a little command line and application, and it boots your entire code base in the command line, where you can start to just write code to play with things and make sure stuff is working. We can start to work with our paste model, and we could say paste equals paste.new. And so we can create that new object just in our code and start to understand what's going on with it. And so here we created a new one, but let's assign the values to it. So let's say at paste dot title equals something, and then we can set the paste.code, great code. And now if we look at that, we can see the difference here on the blank object we created. In the second one, we see we sort of populate things. Now we created this before create method, which We just created a new instance. We didn't actually just create that object. Rails has the differentiation between new and create. Create does things for you, and it automatically saves it to the database. So let's change this to do create and title. Code. And see what happens. So this is all the action that's happening underneath when we were clicking create in this web form. Just creating a new object and saving it to the database. And we can see though that it saves slug. Even though we didn't set slug, it used that callback to go ahead and run that code, generate it, set it. It also sets the created that and updated that by default for us. So we have record keeping of all our things. Along with the ID. The ID in Rails is sacred, more or less, that you let Rails handle the ID column. It does an integer that auto increments. Every database table then has an ID, unless you specify not to, but by default it does. And that way you can do the relationships and easy joins on everything. So that's how that's working. So we just have a little bit of cleanup then to get our application working, and then we can get it deployed here. So we got 13 minutes left. We're going to make it. So we're going to hop over to our paste controller though, and we're going to say, after you create yourself, let's just take you to the specific page for the paste with that slug in there so that the user has the URL to copy right away. So we're going to update this from just saying go to the paste to go to it by the slug. So we're going to do a paste path where the ID is the slug. And then we're going to update the method that finds the paste. So when we take them to that URL, we need to figure out which one to pull back from the database. By default, it's going to look for the ID and just try to pull that out. But we're going to say, hey, let's pull it out by the slug. So we're going to do paste find by slug. And from the parameters, we're going to pull it out as the ID. It's going to show up in the URL. Find by is going to use a select from where slug equals what we set as a value. So now our application is just missing one other piece to make it complete, and that's on the form. We're going to get rid of that slug field. So down at the bottom we had our slug, and we don't need that anymore. So we're just going to generate that for the user. And application's running. So from the slash paste. Here we can create it. Create our paste, and now we can see that it didn't show me the new URL. Let's look at it outside of the browser, outside of this browser. There we go. So here we have our page loading and doing the redirect of the Cloud9 was masking the URL. Let's go ahead and get this deployed out here in our last 10 minutes. So we're going to use, like I mentioned earlier, Heroku, free service, and we're going to deploy our app from the command line with that. The first thing we need to do is use Git to commit our code base so that we can use Heroku to push our Git repository to. So I'm going to do git init And then I'm going to do a get status just to see that everything's there. And then I'm going to do the bad thing of get add dot, where I'm just going to add everything to my Git repository. Do a git commit. I have a message of so that's going to create that. And then I'm going to here's my notes. And I'm going to modify a couple things so that we're ready for Heroku. Now, Heroku doesn't use the same database structure or same database that we're using in development. They use Postgres versus we're using SQLite. So we need to tell our gem file that when you're deploying to production, don't use SQLite, use Postgres as the database. I'll pull that file up here. And there's a SQLite free one, which I'm going to move down into a group for development and tests. So down here we have, I'm going to put our SQLite gem in that, and that will only run for development and tests. And then we're going to create one for production. And gem PG for Postgres. And since we made modifications to our gem file, we need to update all the dependency graph on it. So we're going to do a bundle install, and we're going to say, but do it without production. Since we don't have the Postgres dependencies installed on our Cloud IDE, we don't want to try to install the libraries for that. And now we can do another git commit for everything added. Added Heroku gems. And now we can create our amp on Heroku by doing a Heroku, which is a gem that's installed here. I'll log in. So, and we can do a Heroku create. And that's going to create the app for us. And then we can just do a git push Heroku master. And that is going to deploy our application for us with the demo gods looking down on us for the last minute here. Heroku is nice in the sense that you don't have to manage a server, deal with the security updates on that. That's not so nice as you don't have full control over everything, so it works good for these applications. Push and forget. It's also expensive to run larger scale applications because you're paying for them to support the servers for you. But here is and goes through the process. So it created our application for us and deployed it. The one thing we need to do is just set up that database out there because we did all our work locally. Now we need to say, hey, production database, you need to have these fields. So we're going to do a Heroku run Rails db :migrate. And that's going to go ahead and run the migration on our database out there for us. If you don't like shelling into remote Linux servers, this is great. And then Heroku domains is going to tell us where our application's living. And it gave us a sweet name of Rocky Journey. or create a new paste. And there we go. We have our deployed application, and we have 4 minutes left for questions. Y'all have any questions? Information overload? All right. So now we have our application, so we can profit. And again, thank you very much for coming out today. Again, you can find me on the internet, Johnson CH, and we'll see you next year. Thank you.